Hi folks, Matt Easton here, and welcome to the first of History Story Time with Uncle Matt. That's right. So in the past I've done readings from history, real history, primary history mostly, and this has become amicably known in my channel as kind of like Story Time with Uncle Matt. So that's what we're going to make it. There's going to be a playlist now, and I think it will be a good addition to the channel. So the first story, shall we say, comes from Swordsman of the British Empire. There are newer editions of this book, but essentially it's D.A. Kinsley's work, which you can find on Lulu, and I highly recommend you buy them because they're pretty much unparalleled, unique compilations, mostly about close combat from mostly the 18th and 19th centuries, but also earlier as well. And you might think, well, I'm interested mostly in 16th or 17th centuries, but the anecdotes and stories and first-hand accounts of people who actually fought in close combat in the 18th and 19th centuries are some of the best source material we have for close combat with weapons such as swords, lances, bayonets and such like. And you can learn a lot about close combat by studying this period, even if it's not your primary period of interest. Anyway, on to the first story and the first edition of Story Time. So this is from the Napoleonic Wars. In fact, it's from the Battle of Waterloo. I thought, what better place to start? So we're in 1815 in Belgium, the Battle of Waterloo, one of the most significant battles of the modern world that decided to some extent the fate of Europe and therefore decided the fate of a lot of the rest of the world, bearing in mind that at this point France, Britain and what was soon later to become Germany were the rising world powers that of course would dictate a lot of 20th century or late 19th and 20th century history. So the account starts. A tall, powerful Highlander, Lieutenant John Stewart, who was of the 95th Rifles incidentally, made himself conspicuous at Waterloo by a hand-to-hand encounter which, had he been less active and resolute, must have proved to be his last. So, during one of those lulls which occur in general actions. Now that's an interesting comment, because we often think about battles perhaps through sort of computer game or wargaming experience or even movie experience as something which starts, there's frantic fighting and then it ends. Well, actually most historical battles don't go like that at all. They usually have sort of ebbs and flows. They have lulls, bits where the armies pull back, regroup, reorganize, and sometimes they have essentially chapters to the battle, and that was very much the case with Waterloo, which famously went on for a whole day. Which occur in general actions. Stewart and his men lay in skirmishing order behind a hedge. Okay, very good idea. The hedge obviously provides soft cover in wargaming terms, but if people can't see that you're there, then they can't directly shoot at you. About 60 or 100 yards in front of them. Now, that's interesting because that's pretty damn close, isn't it, when you think about it? 60 or 100 yards. I mean, you can shoot someone with a longbow at that range fairly reliably, or at least at a group of people you can shoot fairly reliably at that range. So this reminds you that even though this is the black powder or gunpowder era, some of the ranges of engagement, even with the firearms, were quite close. Lining in like manner in a ditch or hollow, a body of French tirailleurs had taken post. In other words, there were some French who were also lying in the ditch and hiding behind cover, and there was a sort of standoff. And each party continued for a while to watch without molesting the other. At last, a French officer rose out of his own ditch, and either because he really desired to encourage his men to get out of their ditch and attack the enemy, presumably, or for the mere purpose of bravado, possible, advanced some space into their front, waving his sword in the air. So that's an important point. On this channel we talk a lot about swords and swords as weapons, but you have to remember that in this period a sword was also a badge of office, but it was also a thing that you'd wave in the air to rally your men and lead your men on and show that you were willing to share their fate, as it were. So bearing in mind that the majority of fighting was done by private soldiers and certainly not by officers, and the officers were there purely to lead their men, very often purely by example, not necessarily by knowledge, the sword is an important emblem and implement for doing that. It would have been easy enough to pick him off, for the rifles needed no instruction as marksmen in those days. There's a slight dig there at the marksmen of these days. It's suggesting that the riflemen of 1815 were perhaps better trained and more experienced than when this was being written, which was in 1835. Well, I think that's probably true, because bear in mind, a lot of the British soldiers and other nationality soldiers at the Battle of Waterloo were veterans. They had fought through the wars, and certainly in the British forces, a lot of them had fought throughout the Peninsular War, and so they were experienced riflemen in this case. And rifles are highly accurate, despite the fact they've got a slow rate of fire at this period. They are nevertheless very accurate as most modern rifles, certainly up to 100, 200 yards. But Stuart would not permit that. On the contrary, his orders were, "Men, keep quiet," while he himself sprang through the hedge and ran to meet the French officer. The latter did not shun the duel, of course, so this kind of running out to have a single combat in front of the men, was actually something we see as late as the Japanese-Russian War of 1904 to 6. And it was certainly something that happened right the way through the 19th century, and it was essentially, obviously it's something we see going all the way back to the days of Troy and the Iliad, but this fighting of champions, or in this case officers, in front of the men was an important thing to try and spur them into action, I suppose. And bear in mind, a lot of the time, trying to get your men to do what you want them to do is the real challenge. He too was a tall and active-looking man, and in his rapier he had a decided advantage over Stuart, who was armed with a very crooked sabre, which it was the fashion in those days for officers of the Rifle Corps to carry. So I'm going to pause here for a second and put the book down, because what the author means when they say rapier is probably a small sword, or it could be what the French term an épée, which can be anything from a spadroon, such as this, all the way through to a triangular bladed small sword. Usually in the French army at this time it would actually be a narrow spadroon, or it could be a double-edged spadroon. Okay, so it is something that you could technically cut with, but it's primarily a thrusting sword. It is straight, and it is longer than the sabre that's being mentioned. So for some reason there was a fashion in the Rifle Corps, as is mentioned in this account, for rifle officers to carry a very curved sabre, in fact more curved than this. This is the regulation 1803 pattern. So this was carried by lots of infantry sabres around the time of Waterloo, and from 1803 right the way through to 1822. But for some reason the rifles often carried a steel-hilted version that was even more curved than this. Now, why might you think, does the author think that the spadroon or small sword, or rapier as he calls it, has an advantage? Well, it was very much the prevailing opinion at this time that the straight thrusting sword was had an advantage over the curved sabre in single combat on foot. You might say, so why did people use curved sabres then? Well, clearly some people disagreed with that view, and some people thought the sabre was a better weapon. But remember, this is specifically a duel format. Okay, so when we're fighting in skirmishing and fighting in a melee and fighting in a group, in that scenario, it may have been viewed that the sabre was advantageous, even if in a one-on-one duel, the small sword or spadroon might be advantageous. I'll leave that for now and move on with the account. Yes, so I'll just read that bit again. In the rapier, he had a decided advantage over Stuart, who was armed with a very crooked sabre, which it was the fashion in those days for officers of the Rifle Corps to carry. This is, I can confirm, completely correct. That is right, that rifle officers at that time were very often carrying very curved sabres. The combatants met, and so badly tempered was Stuart's weapon that at the very first pass, it broke off, not far from the hilt. Well, yeah, that happens, doesn't it? So this is something which is often forgotten, is that any weapon can break, and swords are relatively light weapons, and in some cases they're not as good as they should be. Now what's interesting, of course, is that his sabre, which you would think is the more robust, beefier weapon, was the one to break, not the rapier. Very, very interesting. Don't know, they don't explain how that happened exactly. So it broke off not far from the hilt. The Frenchman saw his advantage and prepared to use it. He flourished his sword as if in defiance. That's probably unwise, like one of those movie moments where the baddie kind of gloats before the kill and then loses. And he made a lunge at his adversary's body, which, however, the Highlander received in his left arm. So this is extremely interesting because, of course, if you take particularly a thrust, but it could be a cut as well, in an extremity, it could in that moment give you the advantage in the fight, because yes, you've been wounded, but if you're wounded in a non-critical location, should we say, that gives you some kind of command or control or even delay, just delaying the opponent's weapon or blocking its line to your body or head or throat, then that might give you an advantage even though you're wounded. And before a second thrust could be administered, the two men closed, that means grappled essentially, wrestled. It was the struggle of a moment and no more. Stuart bore his enemy to the earth, superior grappling, better wrestler, maybe just bigger, stronger, and with the broken piece of his sabre slew him. This was written by the Reverend G.R. Grieg in Story of the Battle of Waterloo, 1848. I think I gave the wrong date for that earlier. I was looking at a different source. So 1848 this was written in. So bearing in mind, this is an account of something that happened a long time before, and we can't say how true or accurate it is, but there are elements within this story that to me smell of veracity, they smell of truth. There are specific names given and regiments, and the details of the fact that the French officer would usually be using some form of épée, a small sword or a spadroon, and indeed the rifles officer would be using a very crooked, as they called it at the time, or curved sabre. So there we go, that's the anecdote of the time, but there's some interesting things in there, and I think there are a few things we should take away from that to to remember for when we're analysing historical combat in the future. One is that at the time it was seen that in one-on-one combat, the straight thrusting sword had the advantage, at least in mortal combat, over the very curved sabre. It could simply be because it's more easy to give a killing blow with a straight thrusting sword than it is with a very curved sabre through clothes, as I've spoken about in previous videos. Additionally, that sometimes swords break. In fact, very often swords broke in combat, unfortunately, and other weapons broke as well. Going all the way back to the medieval period. This isn't just a 19th century thing. And you know, finally, the fact that the use of another limb and grappling. So this isn't how we would normally see fencing or combat in a treatise, and you know, within most of the rules of swordsmanship in the 18th and 19th centuries, after the small sword period anyway, grappling and commands wasn't allowed in sal fencing at all, although it is shown in small sword treatises and it is discussed in some sabre treatises. People who study earlier systems, medieval and Renaissance, tend to think that the 18th and 19th century stuff doesn't really have any grappling in it. But the fact is, it's clear that grappling happens in combat, and it did happen then as well. And as we saw then, in some cases, even with a broken sword, you can still overcome the opponent if you're willing to command or delay or control their weapon in some way in order to use the remnants, the broken off part of the hilt plus the base of the blade, so the fort or ricasso, and use it essentially as a dagger. So there we go. I hope that's been an interesting first story time with Uncle Matt. And obviously I'm still doing all my usual videos on Schola Gladiatoria channel, but I will be doing a few more videos where I look at original historical sources like this, pull them out and discuss them for your pleasure on this channel. If you have any specific accounts or even battles, or if you found something yourself you'd like me to analyse and talk about, by all means email it to me or message me on Facebook, or email the Club Schola Gladiatoria email address, and maybe I'll consider it interesting enough to discuss in one of these story times. Thanks for watching. Please give me a like, subscribe if you haven't done already, and I'll see you soon for another video on Schola Gladiatoria channel. Bye folks! Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers folks!